keep Claudio bought a new house out Framingham Way or something, which has like this fully finished downstairs rumpus room, now music studio with a upright piano, and he bought a Gretsch drum set. So he's in one way really psyched to have rehearsals, but in another way it's like can't really, until it's safe. When is it safe? It's safe for me. But Liz hasn't had her first. Have you had one yet?
I got my first, but it's just happenstance.
Yeah.
Okay, 1 minute to
Right.
showtime.
Okay.
Dean, you're off mic.
Okay. And everybody I know who's got a number two. Although actually my person was.
You're off mic.
And I have scheduled that on Wednesday.
Okay. Good morning. Charlie, can you hear me?
Fine.
Okay. How's everybody? Welcome to Community Church of Boston. My name is Dean Stevens. I am a longtime member here and presently serve as your fake minister and also a guitar player and music director. And one of my very favorite parts of this job, of which there are many, and there's some less favorite too, but is the privilege of finding amazing music to share with you. And this morning is absolutely no exception. In fact, it's the finest I can find. These are players of incredibly profound depth and grace and elegance and style. I'll start with Dan Greenspan, who's my longtime friend and husband of the late Mili Bermejo of blessed memory, singer extraordinaire, Mexican jazz singer, Mexican-American jazz singer, a professor at Berkeley. Dan, we're so glad to have you with us. Dan used to live in Boston, but then moved to New Hampshire, where he didn't forsake his career as a fabulous bass player, but he took up something where he's making a lot more dough. That would be that he's a baker of delicious, incredible bread. He still keeps his hand at it. And in my mind, the preferable pianist of any other in Boston, and that's saying a whole lot. I just found out that Tim Ray, among his credits, is Tony Bennett's accompanist. I went online and found that out, and it just doubled my pleasure in having these two here for you this morning. Folks, will you welcome to our humble Community Church of Boston stage, Tim Ray and just so glad to be here. And folks, just the experience of having players live and in person. I wish I weren't the only one loving this moment for a beautifully tuned piano. It was just done yesterday for this occasion, and for welcoming you to join us eventually, slouching back physically towards Community Church, where someday we'll be together. Is that right? I hope you agree that that's what we're looking forward to. But we're also looking forward to taking this opportunity to make this a permanent broadcast where we do this every Sunday, even when we're back physically in this room. And we're trying to figure out how to do that well with elegance and style. It's hard meeting the technical challenge of doing it well, but we will figure it out. I light this candle for 3 recently departed folks of our community. One is Bob Datilio. We celebrated his memorial virtually about 2 weeks ago. The other one is Reverend William Alberts, who was our minister for 10 years, passed away a week and a half ago. There is a obituary of William, of Bill, in last Wednesday's Boston Globe. You can also find it on our Facebook page, a link to that obituary. Also this morning, Laura Dowd, who was not a member of this congregation, but a member of my wife's congregation, passed yesterday. I remember her very fondly, and her husband, who's named David Gologly, who has given us a lot of advice on this building. David was the construction manager for the city of Boston before he retired. Laura Dowd presente is what we say. Bill Alberts presente. And Bob Datilio presente. I want to start with 2 readings. One on the occasion of National Poetry Month, and we have a bunch of poetry lined up for later on in this month. And here's how this reading from Walt Whitman goes. This is what you shall do. Love the earth and sun and the animals. Despise riches. Give alms to everybody that asks. Stand up for the stupid and crazy. Devote your income and labor to others. Hate tyrants. Argue not concerning God. Have patience and indulgence toward the people. Take off your hat to nothing known or unknown, or to any man or number of men. Go freely with powerful, uneducated persons, and with the young and with the mothers of families. Re-examine all you have been told at school or church or in any book. Dismiss whatever insults your own soul. And your flesh shall be a great poem and have the richest fluency, not only in its words, but in the silent lines of its lips and face, and between the lashes of your eyes, and in every motion and joint of your body. That's from Walt Whitman, Leaves of Grass. And here's another reading that's in line with our subject today, and that is socialism. Despite everything you hear, it's not a bad word, and it's enshrined in our statement of principles that's from 1921. In fact, I find it to be exactly 100 years ago. This was signed on the 12th day of April, 1921. And it says, it states the purpose of community church, which is the community church shall be a free fellowship of men and women dedicated to the fulfillment of social idealism through common service for the common good. It seeks to cultivate the open mind, the aspiring spirit, the passion for justice, and here's the reason I read this, the application of the cooperative principle to all forms of social and economic life. We just found this in the archives. It was untouched in a folder, and we've had it beautifully framed, and it's on our wall between the 2 bathrooms, just in case you wanted to know where you can find it, here at the auditorium of the church in Copley Square. There's a little bit more churchy stuff to go, but I want to just bring back Dan Greenspan and Tim Ray for the next number. And we want to make our church stuff really short because we're just so excited to hear Professor Richard Wolff this morning. Thank you all for joining us, and welcome back Tim Ray and Dan Greenspan.
Sure, yes.
Hello, we're very glad to be here, Dan and I. We began with the service today with a tune by Antonio Carlos Jobim, great Brazilian composer, called Mojave, and now another great composer, Silvio Rodriguez from Cuba, and this is one of his songs. Getting thumbs up from Dean, and a song that Dan and I, of course, performed many times with Mili Bermejo, who Dean was referencing earlier. This is called Mi Lecho.
I just love the music of Silvio Rodriguez. They called Bob Dylan the Silvio Rodriguez of the United States. That's the length and breadth of this man's career. And it's just so great that they have chosen that song. There's another one that's called Rabo de Nube that Tim does amazing things with. It's just a fabulous thing. I have a few other little items here. One this is called a Radical Diary, Verso's Radical Diary, that tells us that April 4th is when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And here's a quote from MLK: "A true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth." I want to also call your attention to a couple of books that came in from a publisher that's called Island Press. We are featuring two different authors from Island Press. The first one is called Carrie Gillum, and this book is called The Monsanto Papers, and it's a book about a man named Lee Johnson who was a caretaker at a high school and whose job was to dispense a lot of Roundup on fields, and he got very sick and he sued Monsanto and he won an enormous settlement. Of course, it's still in appeals process, but Carrie Gillum wrote a book about that case, and it's called The Monsanto Papers, and she will join us at some Sunday upcoming. I forget, I don't have it in front of me. There's also another book that's called Reinventing Food Banks and Pantries by Katie S. Martin. Katie will also join us, and she'll be talking about food insecurity and new strategies to address food insecurity. It's an especially huge topic right here in Copley Square, the center of wealth and power and fancy shopping, where there are also a ton of homeless people in the park and in the alleyway behind us, looking through the dumpsters. And so this will be a really interesting Sunday that we'll have upcoming, along with a bunch of wonderful players, musicians. I want to tell you about what happened on Good Friday here at Community Church, which was that Louis Randa's Peace Abbey folks came by here pulling an enormous monument, which is a tribute to global pandemics. I'll show you the monument. That's Community Church in the background. It's one of those tall, commercial-looking storefront buildings with the clover in the first floor. And this is the monument to global pandemics, and they had stops at various different churches, and as usual, it's an incredibly inspired and quixotic endeavor, as Louis Randa of the Peace Abbey is wont to engage in. This monument, if you want to see it, is presently parked in front of Old South Church, just a half a block away from here. And here's where it is. It lays, and behind it is an enormous display of paper cranes, Hiroshima paper cranes. Also, I got to say a few words when they stopped here, and they parked in front, and they didn't get a parking ticket, which was an amazing thing. But on our sidewalk, we're featuring on this weekend of Holy Week and Good Friday especially, where the crucifixion is remembered, this amazing painting by Katie Martin. And this is a Pietà, which is of course the classic pose of Mary with the dead Jesus off the cross. But in this one, Jesus has a keffiyeh. It happened in the West Bank, if you recall, and Mary is wearing a hijab. And to me, this painting by Katie Martin El Ali, who is from California, and just speaks to so many things, and we're so proud that she gave us permission to display it on a sandwich board on the street in Copley Square to the passersby. I want to tell you that our new newsletter is here, and it has a listing of all the programs from now until June, and it is a rich feast of different things. I mentioned Carrie Gillum, the Monsanto Papers. I mentioned Katie Martin about food insecurity. We have a whole mess of poets who are doing a program that's called the Poets Theater. And of course, Richard Wolff today we have. And on May 1st, May 2nd is Judith Woodruff, who's repeating an encore of her incredible program that's called The Red and Green of May Day. Judith Woodruff, our own board member and longtime member of Community Church. We have a storytelling Sunday with Andy Davis, Judith Black, Jackson Gilman. We also have a Sunday that is my favorite because it's all of my tribe. It's called the Sweet Chariot Music Festival. It's an all music program on May 23rd, which is the day before Dean's birthday. That would be me. And there will be maybe a dozen different players who will be joining us that morning to sing one song apiece. And I wish we could all play together for you. And then we have, so it's a rich feast. Let me not forget the last one, which is Jen Mirapol will be joining us on June 6th. Every year, the first Sunday in June, we remember the Rosenbergs, executed in, what is it, 1953 or 54, I forget which. But Community Church did an enormous drive to keep them from being executed. And we remember them every beginning of June, which is the anniversary of their execution. Richard Wolff is our speaker this morning, and we're so honored to have him. And we have shortened our churchy stuff so we can bring him right up. If none of you are familiar, if some of you are not familiar with Richard, just go on YouTube and you can find just incredible wealth of content from Richard, interviewed by a lot of different speakers, different interviewers and news people, Democracy Now! And it goes on and on. We're just so glad to have this new voice. First time, I believe, to Community Church. Richard, I want to tell you that you are in good company. Community Church, if folks don't know, has this just renowned history of speakers, orators of the day. Back in the day, Community Church met in Symphony Hall, where the likes of Martin Luther King Jr., Thurgood Marshall, Henry Wallace, Norman Thomas, the list goes on and on. Now we have just one of the most prominent speakers on the topic of what we call in our founding document, the cooperative principle, to join us this morning. We are so honored that you are with us, Richard. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Let me begin by thanking the Community Church of Boston for inviting me. It is an honor, and I mean that very sincerely. I was also moved by the music, which is spectacular and does honor to all the other dimensions of what you do. I might even mention that there's a certain kind of homecoming here. Many years ago, I was a student for 4 years in the Boston area, and I attended several events of the Community Church because the college where I was kind of scarce on progressive activity, and the church was a welcome opportunity for me to come in from Cambridge and participate. So there is a kind of homecoming. Might have been a bit nicer if I had been in person, but we all understand that we can't do that. So let me begin by a bit of a forewarning. I am going to talk about the economic and political and social crisis of the United States at this time. And I'm going to do it borrowing from a wonderful Christian philosopher of a long time ago, a German named Hegel. And his greatest student, by the way, was Karl Marx. And my work is influenced by both of those enormously productive thinkers. Hegel's contribution was to teach us that all things that we can think about, all things that are in the world are, as he put it, in a perpetual state of contradiction and change. We know that from popular wisdom, which says every good thing has a bad side, every bad thing has a good side, every blessing is also enwrapped in a curse, and vice versa. Hegel made this comment in a general philosophic way. His student, Karl Marx, applied it to the economic system of his time, capitalism, which has survived until it's also the economic system of our time. And he said that it has its good parts, but it also has its bad parts, and that the dynamic of change of capitalism is a struggle, if you like, a contest, a shifting balance between the positive and the negatives as they change each other and as they are changed by the larger context of nature, of history, and of all the cultural phenomena of our lives. Please keep this balance of the positive and the negative in your mind, because I'm going to try to explain in the time that we have what the problems of US capitalism are, and they are daunting. And I'm also going to conclude by talking about a way out, a way forward, building on certain positivities of this capitalist system that give us a chance to get out of the dilemmas that are crowding in on us. So let me begin. I believe we are in a period of time which can best be captured by the following somewhat scary understanding. The American period of empire, which is now roughly 100 years old. We became the dominant economic power in the world as a result of World War I. In that war, the dominant capitalist country of the previous 2 centuries, namely Great Britain, was finally destroyed. The only other contender for dominant economic power at that time, 100 years ago, was Germany. And what basically happened was that the German and British empires destroyed one another in that great conflagration, World War I, which also took down virtually every other aspiring would-be economic empire, the Austro-Hungarian, the French, and so forth. What emerged was a century of US economic dominance. It was a century in which American capitalism grew spectacularly, consolidated its global position after World War II, literally by doing something no empire had done before. Even the British Empire, with its far-flung colonial system, of which the United States had been a part. Even the British Empire could not and did not equal what the United States was able to accomplish between 1921 and now. The dollar became the world currency that everybody basically used. I'm assuming most of you know that even to this day, most of the central banks that govern the financial world around the world keep a disproportionate portion of their reserves, what they have to back their currencies, in holdings of US dollars. No other country comes close in the last 100 years to the economic, political, military, and cultural dominance the United States achieved. Our culture, based on advertising, became dominant around the world. Our culture based on movies, radio, television, book publishing, and I could go on, became dominant globally. And the bases, the military bases, thousands of them scattered across all continents, had never been seen in the history of the world before. A heady time, and not fundamentally threatened by anyone. I know this goes against the grain of what many have been taught, but it is typical of empires to downplay at the same time that they celebrate their empire. There's that Hegelian contradiction. On the one hand, you flaunt your power and your wealth. On the other hand, you hide it. You kind of don't want some of the seedier parts to get out there, and so you hide it. Let me give you just one example. At the end of World War I, the Russian Empire was also destroyed alongside the Austrian, the French, and the Germans and the British. But the collapse of the Russian Empire took a peculiar, unusual form. In the collapse of that empire, a small, radical political movement known as the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party was able to move quickly to take political power in the collapsing empire. An empire collapsing because the Russians were the first country to withdraw from World War I because they had lost it. The collapse of Russia, the collapse of its empire, the loss it suffered in World War I gave this socialist party, Russian Democratic Socialist Workers' Party, a chance to seize power, which it did. And it proclaimed against capitalism. But there was something ludicrous in all of this, because the capitalism of the rest of the world, the United States leading, but also Britain, France, Germany, and so on, made the small anti-capitalism that succeeded in Russia look ridiculously puny and weak. We should remember that Russia in 1917, when the revolution there occurred, was the poorest, most backward part of Europe, a place in which the vast majority of people were illiterate and were agricultural peasants. But the United States was sufficiently frightened by the very tiny, ludicrous Russian Revolution that, together with the British and the French and the Japanese, sent troops, landed in Russia to overthrow the new socialist government. 10,000 American troops were sent to Russia to overthrow their government. Nothing comparable ever happened in reverse. No Russian troops ever arrived in the United States to overthrow anything. It might make you wonder about the rationale for much of the second half of the 20th century of viewing the Soviet Union as the threat to the United States, when the only credible basis for who threatens whom runs exactly the other way. But so it is with empires. They hide the parts of themselves that are not so positive while they trumpet and celebrate those that are. So let's quickly review. The United States became, in the last 100 years, the richest country basically in the world, the dominant economic power. To give you an example, even in the 1970s, when this whole situation peaked, the United States was able to maintain a global ring of bases while being at the same time more capable of giving its working class a high standard of living than any other country in the world, and certainly any major country. So successful, so robust had been its capitalism's growth, aided by the weakness, of course, of all the potential competitors who not only destroyed each other in World War I, but basically a few years later did it again in World War II. So there were no effective competitors, no minor matter, as we will see when I conclude today, because today we do have a competitor, and a very powerful one. But we had none for the 20th century, and we took full advantage. We became very rich and very powerful, able to distribute our culture and our social values globally, sometimes peacefully and sometimes with an endless series of foreign military interventions, especially in Latin America, but globally. And we are still trying to do that. We did it 20 years ago in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the difference between those interventions and some of the earlier ones in the 20th century has to be faced. These most recent ones are failures. We went into Afghanistan, and the Taliban, our ostensible enemy, is stronger today than it was when the United States intervened. And the opposition to the United States in Iraq is also now stronger than what it was when the United States arrived. Whatever else these interventions accomplish, they are a sign that the rest of the world has not missed, even if Americans can't quite face it, that the empire is over. And I need you at least to begin to face that if you haven't already. Because a society on the downside of empire is a very different place from the society on the upswing towards its empire peak. If you want to understand our future, look at the last 2 years of the United Kingdom, because its decline is the image of where we are headed. Britain is now a small, cold, wet, offshore island of Europe. It is unable, even to this day, to face the reality that what happens in London is a minor detail in world history rather than being the center of it. And the odd peculiarities of British history over the last century are full of insights into what we are going through now. But more than foreign, I want us to concentrate on the United States. And what are the signs of a declining empire we need to think about? And of course, there are many, and I only have time to focus on 2 or 3, but they need to be understood in this context. I'll start with COVID, this viral pandemic we are going through. The United States has 4% of the world's population, but we account for 20% of the world's deaths from COVID. Don't forget that statistic. It screams its message if you're only able to hear it. We are a very wealthy country, among the wealthiest in the world. We have a highly developed medical care system, medical schools, clinics, hospitals, you name it. We are the home of major pharmaceutical and medical device makers. We have an elaborate health insurance industry. We have what it takes to face and deal with a virus. Countries much less wealthy and much less well-served by a medical system. And let me mention a few to you. Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, Vietnam, Cuba, I could go on, were able to achieve tiny fractions of the cases we have, tiny fractions of the deaths we have suffered. And that's the case whether you look at the country as a whole or you work it all out on a per person basis. They've outperformed us. The People's Republic of China, with a population 4 times that of the United States, has a tiny fraction of the number of cases and deaths. What in the world is going on? That's a level of failure that is catastrophic, not just in the suffering of all the families touched by this virus, but for all of the rest of us as well, as we confront what is going on here. How do we account for this? And however much you might like to blame this or that politician, and I include here Donald Trump, you could not possibly explain this failure on one or another individual or one or another political party. Let me give you another example, one that's in the news right now and will continue to be, at least for the next several weeks. The United States ranks very low on the quality of our so-called infrastructure, our roads, our highways, our bridges, our rail system, our you name it, all of the things that support our society on a literal minute-by-minute basis. We as a nation have let the care of the infrastructure, which always has to be maintained because it's always wearing out. An infrastructure, as Hegel would have enjoyed telling us, is both a producer of good results in sustaining our society and a deteriorating entity that undermines it. It is, as Hegel liked to say, in contradiction, or experiencing or expressing its own dialectic. The language doesn't matter. The idea is simple. Something about American capitalism fails to attend to the infrastructure, allows it to fall apart. This morning, a major headline across this country was about a wastewater treatment facility in the state of Florida collapsing, risking flooding rural countrysides and housing with polluted water that includes radioactive What is going on here? If you read more about it, you discover that Florida has had 27, count them, of these kinds of collapses of wastewater in recent times. Well, we know the answer, and I'm going to give it to you quickly. It's not profitable to prepare for a virus, you see. A company that makes masks or gloves or ventilators or hospital beds does not want to produce these things, then stockpile them in warehouses around the country, maintain them, repair them, clean them, secure them for an indefinite amount of time until the next virus comes along. That's not profitable. That's too risky. So the private companies that could have produced the tests and masks and everything else we need didn't do so. They found more profitable investments elsewhere. And that's how our system of capitalism works. So they invested elsewhere. And when the virus came, we couldn't handle it. Wow. And why don't we have an infrastructure that's decent? Because once again, we manage it in a way that is fundamentally a failure. Here's what we do. We say it's the government's job to maintain roads, highways, bridges, etc. And the government is given that task. Okay, but this takes a lot of money. So the government has to get a lot of money to perform its task. Where does it get the money? It gets the money by taxing corporations, individuals, and guess what? In our culture, corporations and individuals don't want to pay taxes. The mass of people basically can't because their incomes aren't enough. And the corporations don't want to, even though they could. And the rich don't want to, even though they could. And so they use their wealth to make sure that the politicians don't tax them. Well, if you can't tax the mass of people and you won't tax the corporations and the rich, you won't have the money to sustain the infrastructure. And since the collapsing infrastructure conveniently collapses slowly, each politician can avoid it until he or she moves up the political ladder, leaving the declining infrastructure to whoever comes next. And we are now stuck with an infrastructure that hobbles American capitalism when compared to capitalisms that have behaved differently. And now let me give you the third example. We have allowed our capitalist system to re-establish a level of inequality that is literally mind-blowing. We are returning to levels of inequality last seen in ancient Egypt or the Middle Ages. Let me pick Jeffrey Bezos, even though there's nothing particular about him, but he's a good example. His personal assets now are about $200 billion. That's right. We give to one individual an amount of money that is more than the total income of many countries in the world, encompassing many millions of people. Mr. Bezos is one of about 600 of America's richest, the 600 whose personal wealth is $1 billion or more. Together, these people increased their wealth over the last 12 months by more than $1 trillion. Let me hammer this home. Over the last year, roughly 60 million Americans, more than 1/3 of the labor force, had to go and get unemployment insurance. Some of those millions have been unemployed for the entire year, some only a few weeks. But we know that when you are unemployed, you quickly use up whatever savings you have, and the American working class doesn't have many savings. You suffer all kinds of mental and physical impairments. You lose contact with your fellow workers, your skills. You become a burden on your family. That's why rates of alcoholism, divorce, child abuse all go up during unemployment. The social costs beyond measure. 60 million, more than 1/3 of the workforce, means that every family, with a very few exceptions, had either mama or papa or cousin or grandma or you name it, out of work, leaning on the rest of the family to help get through this. That catastrophe for the mass of the American people stands in contrast to the growing wealth of over $1 trillion by the people who were already the richest people in the country. That's a system that is failing. Well, you might say, yes, we've had those in the past. Yes, we have. But in the last 100 years of America's ascendancy, before it peaked, we congratulated ourselves on having, quote, a vast middle class, having, quote, a system that's like a rising tide that lifts all boats, having a commitment to equality, having a commitment to everybody being able to anticipate and work to achieve the American dream. All that is over. It's important that we face this reality. We don't have to worry, as the Biden administration does, about how and where to pay for the infrastructure program, which, by the way, is pegged at $2 trillion. More than half of it could be immediately paid for if we simply taxed the wealth increase over the last 12 months of the already 600 billionaires in America, who would remain, if we levied such a tax, the richest people in America and the world, only we wouldn't have to worry about fixing our infrastructure. But in our system, what I just said seems now to be unthinkable. Well, maybe if you understood that this grotesque inequality and the failure around COVID and the failure of our infrastructure management are all signs of something that is declining. It is the American empire. Now, let me turn, before I tell you what I think is the way out, to one more dimension. There is now a real competitor, the way there wasn't in the 20th century. And you all know who that competitor is. It's the People's Republic of China. They have achieved an absolutely extraordinary economic development, as extraordinary in its way as the achievement of economic development was in the United States, which in turn was an advance on the achievement of global superiority that the British Empire had acquired before. The rise and fall of empires is not new. It's a very old, often repeated part of world history. There was never any reason to doubt that the American empire would be born, would grow, would evolve, and would decline. We are now declining. These are the signs. But there is a capitalism, and I'm going to explain what I mean by that, a capitalism that is competing with us now. It is, in a sense, where the dynamic of capitalism has moved in the last 40 years. That dynamic, which was once located in the British economic system and the British Empire, and then moved to the American economic system and the American empire, has now moved again, as its movements have always moved it again. Only this time it moved to China. That's where it has established itself. And it has grown over the last 4 decades much faster than the British Empire ever did, and much faster than the American Empire ever did. Let me give you just a couple of statistics. Bear with me, I'm an economist. We do this to show you what I mean. Over the last 25, 30 years, the United Nations and many other institutions keep track of the growing economic output of goods and services in each country. The shorthand way of describing that is the GDP, the gross domestic product of each country. It's measured for the United States, for China, and for all other countries. Over the last 25 years, the average rate of growth of the GDP in the United States was between 2 and 3% per year. Over the same period of time, the average rate of growth of the GDP of the People's Republic of China was 6 to 9%. In other words, for 30 years, China has grown much, much faster than the United States. There is no way to pretend that that didn't happen, even though most leading Republican and Democratic politicians do their level best not to acknowledge or face or discuss or analyze what I just said. To show you what it means, over the last 20 years, the average real income of the worker in China has quadrupled. That means in the memory of the working class in China, they had never seen or heard in the history of China for centuries of a growth in their standard of living comparable to what they have now achieved. Over the same 30 years, the real wage, the real standard of living of American workers has gone exactly nowhere. It's stagnant. Their incomes go off the charts. The American working class goes nowhere. If you adjust the increase in money wages Americans have gotten for the prices they have to pay They're no better off now than they were 30 years ago. And you all kind of know that, because the only way that the American working class has been able to continue to consume at the level they have is because they have found another way to pay for it. Their wages couldn't. You know what they did? They went into debt, mortgage debt, car payment debt, credit card debt, and now the remarkable one, student debt. Vast indebtedness, hobbling every family 10 different ways. That's the price paid when an economy goes down, when an empire is in decline. These are the signs. Okay, let me then conclude and tell you how I think we might escape the risks, the pitfalls, the dangers of an economy and an empire in decline. There is an aspect to all of this that is crucial to think about. We allow in our society a tiny minority of people to make most of the crucial economic decisions that are now playing themselves out in the unsolved problems accumulating for American capitalism. The COVID problem, the infrastructure problem, the inequality problem, but you know what else? The racial divisions in this country, the political polarization, all of it. Who are these tiny people? Not some conspiracy. We don't need that. We know where the decisions are made. Here's the answer, and here's the way out. We organize our enterprises in a very particular way. And I'm talking about our factories, our offices, our stores, and indeed the institutions that model themselves on the enterprises, like the hospitals, like the schools, and so on. Each organization, each enterprise has this same basic organization. At the top is a tiny group of people, the owner of the enterprise. If it's a corporation and they do most of the enterprise work in the economy of the United States, if it's a corporation, this tiny group is called the board of directors, usually 10, 20 people. That's it. Elected, by the way, by the owners. And who are the owners? The shareholders. And what do we know about shareholders? The 10% richest share owners in this country own 80% of all the shares. So it's a tiny minority, the owners, if you like, the board of directors they create, the top executives they call in to run the business. This is a tiny group of people, 10, 20, 30, 40, that's it, who make all the decisions. Those decisions impact all of the employees who, it is important to understand, are excluded from those decisions. They have to live with the result of those decisions, but they are excluded from participating in making them. So, for example, when hundreds of American companies decided over the last 40 years to close or shrink operations in the United States while moving or opening them in the People's Republic of China, this was a job for a Chinese worker, and it was a lost job for an American worker, wasn't it? The workers didn't make those decisions. They are required to live with them, but they are excluded inside every enterprise from making them. When an enterprise decides to replace workers with machines, who makes that decision? The owner, the director, the tiny minority. When I told you the story about the profit maximizing decisions that led the companies in America not to produce the masks, the testing equipment, the hospital beds to fight COVID, those decisions were made by a tiny group of people. And here's the best example. If you allow a tiny group of people at the top of every factory, store, or office to make all the key decisions, you're saying that the profits, the net revenue generated in every enterprise, flows into the hands of those who make the decisions at the top. And is it really surprising that if you organize your enterprises that way, the people who have the profits into their hands at the top distribute them, here we go now, to themselves? Hello, is this a surprise that the bulk of the profits get handed out as dividends to shareholders or handed out as whopping salaries to CEOs? How could you possibly find this surprising? Or to say the same thing in a different way, how do you imagine this problem is going to be solved? Here comes the punchline. If you do not change the organization of enterprises. Well, some of you, and I am now going to conclude, some of you may imagine that this problem can be solved by appealing to our political leaders. You know, the people who sit at the top of the pyramid of the two-party monopoly that controls American politics. But if you think that, you really are being unrealistically naive. The few at the top of every enterprise long ago understood that they are in danger. The wealth they have accumulated, the power that they wield, their exclusion of the mass of people over whom they wield power from any participation, which, by the way, is the definition of the absence of democracy. Those people knew they were at risk because we do have a universal suffrage commitment in our society. We all vote, and the overwhelming majority of us are employees. So there's always the danger, if we vote, that we'll vote in somebody who would undo what the economic capitalist system we have keeps doing. They know it. It's we who have been slow to figure it out. So they made sure to buy the political system, to make sure that whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, you're not going to face anything like what I've been talking about for the last 45 minutes, that it's not going to be on the agenda. So to look to them to come up with a program is, in my humble opinion, hopeless and pointless. They cannot, they will not, they never have, and they're not about to now. All Mr. Biden's talk about infrastructure boils down to this. He's going to hand out, if he gets his way, $2 trillion to countless companies and government officials. The government officials will then take the money and hand it out to companies who will be hired to do various things, like rebuild roads and highways. But they will do it in the way they normally do. giving themselves the lion's share of the money, dictating how, when, and where it's done, using good part of the money to automate so they're more profitable in the future when this program is over. They will do as they always have done. Reproduce a system that they sit at the top of is their number one commitment. That's all profit maximization has ever meant. So if you want to solve the problem, if you want the way down of a declining economy not to be handled as it has been, by offloading the pain and the difficulty of empire decline onto the mass of the people so that the super rich at the top can indulge their fantasies that their dominant global position isn't over, then there is a way to do this. You have to change the organization of enterprises. As your wonderful rediscovered 1921 declaration that you have now on that beautiful frame that Dean Stevens opened with and is showing us again. You understood. People have always understood somewhere beneath the layers of ideological indoctrination. They've always understood that there is an alternative. And that alternative can best be summarized this way: democratize the enterprise. Finally bring democracy to the workplace where it should have been all along. And here's what I mean, so there's no mistake. The enterprise, the workplace, becomes a place where every man and every woman has a vote, an equal vote, one vote per person. And together, collectively and democratically, will decide what the company or enterprise produces in the way of goods or services, what technology it uses, where it conducts its business, and here comes the big one, how to utilize the profits that everybody who works there has contributed to producing. Here's what I can guarantee you. If these decisions were made democratically by everyone, you would never give billions of dollars to a handful of people while everybody else cannot afford to send their kid to college. Not gonna happen. Here's another decision that wouldn't have happened. You wouldn't have sent all your factories to China. You wouldn't have done that. Here's another example. If there's a new technology that is terribly bad for your air or your water or your ears, you would have voted not to use that technology. Why? Because you don't live in a gated community 50 miles away. You don't live in an office that can be soundproof. You're a worker, and therefore the technology's costs are borne by you. And if you made the decision, you would balance profits, yeah, you want those, against your sanity and your health, because yeah, you want those. If workers collectively and democratically owned and operated the enterprises, they wouldn't be profit maximizers. Because profit maximizing is running an enterprise to maximize something that goes to a tiny group of people. A cooperative enterprise maximizes a whole range of things that reflect what's valuable and important for all of the people there. The passion Americans sometimes bring to democratic values in politics have been peculiarly unapplied to economics, with the kinds of disastrous results I have listed for you today, and that you know. Cooperation is not just a nice, warm, cuddly, good thing to do. Cooperation is what can save us from the collapse of our system that we are now entering onto. The aggressor in the United States-China dispute is the United States. We're not happy, we say, with their lack of freedom in Hong Kong. Really? I'm not going to defend anything that they do. But the notion that the United States, which is now for 20 years destroying Afghanistan, Iraq, and countless others, is hardly in a position to question our treatment of our African-American brothers and sisters, is not getting us sanctioned by other countries, but we're sanctioning the Chinese because they treat their Muslim minority. This is the country that banned Muslims from coming here, that has a problem with physically assaulting Muslims and now Asia. What is going on here? The United States is disputing China's rights in a place called the South China Sea. You know why it's called that? Because it's over there. They're not in the Caribbean disputing our position there. What's going on here are bizarre, and they're more signs, as I told you, of a declining empire flailing around, desperate to hold on to what it no longer is. We need the transition to a democratically organized enterprise, not only because it's democratic, but because it's the one way forward that can allow us to do what needs to be done for our public health, for our egalitarian values. Otherwise, the prospect is for more in the future, and that prospect alone should persuade us. Thank you so much for your invitation. I hope I have not stretched your interests or your credulity, but these are very, very important issues close to the hearts of all of us, I think, if we only dare to think about them and to talk about them. Thank you again.
Everybody, some hands for Professor Richard Wolff. And grab this mic. Thank you so much. That was an incredible presentation. And everybody on this Zoom call, as well as all the other people on the YouTube channel, thank you so much for being with us. We will have a Q&A after one last song. But first, I want to show you two baskets. This one is the Easter basket. I am obsessed with the spring image of the egg. And you don't even have to go looking around the auditorium for them because they're all in this basket. Some of them came from thrift stores, and some of them came from a beach that my wife and child and I go to in Maine that is very good at making egg-shaped rocks. I'll show you this one that used to be a brick and is now an egg, thanks to the action of waves on a shore. And this is maybe my favorite one that I'll end with. It's just a gorgeous egg-shaped stone. For the occasion of Easter, I brought these in for you. The symbol of fertility, fecundity. And now I have another basket, which is our collection basket. It happens to have in it a few checks that have come in recently to our office at 565 Boylston Street, Boston, Massachusetts, 02116. And we're hoping that you will add to that basket through our website by credit card and PayPal, or you can send a check to the address that I just very quickly sent to you, or that is listed on the chat. So that's my little money pitch. We need every help we can get from you to continue these programs, the likes of Richard Wolff and the likes of the one we had the last time that Dan and Tim were here, where we gave our Sacco and Vanzetti Award to Daniel Ellsberg. And we have them again for one last song. Thank you again, both of you, for gracing us with Silvio Rodriguez and with Milton Nascimento. And we have one more for you here.
Yes.
Sorry.
No worries. Thank you. Thank you, Dean. And thank you again for having us here. Very glad to be here. This is a song by Kenny Wheeler called Maybelle.
express your appreciation to Dan Greenspan and Tim Ray for being part of our program this morning. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Tim Ray and Dan Greenspan. We hope to see you again. The sooner the better. We have a bunch of great music coming up in upcoming Sundays. Jay Mankita, Community Voices, the Sweet Chariot Music and Arts Festival, David Rovics, Rob Flax, all kinds of incredible players coming up. We have some time to thank Richard Wolff and bend his ear a little bit. I was just thinking about community church and the beginnings of community church in opposition to World War I profiteering, in opposition to the rise of American empire, support for the conscientious objectors during World War I, support for early efforts to embrace the African American experience, support for labor union strikes in Lawrence and Lowell, and thinking about now 100 years later, it's kind of like an empire sandwich, and we're on the other end of it. And my first question, Richard, is asking you to elaborate what we do at this juncture to continue to bring forth an era of greatness in American thinking on this same cooperative principle that we were founded on 100 years ago.
Well, I think in part my answer is you're doing what has to be done even by these programs that you put on, these kinds of conversations you encourage, you provide a platform for, that you encourage in other people to continue, you stimulate people who will then in turn talk to their friends, their relatives, their co-workers. This is the way an understanding spreads that can then become a political movement. And that is as it should be. You are doing what has to be done. The crucial thing is to be daring about what has to be, to face the severity of what we are now going through and become, in some sense, adequate to that. Let me give you an example. Joseph Biden, who clearly is, I'm assuming that we all can agree on this, clearly is better than what we had before, is nonetheless busy comparing himself to FDR, in telling us that he's not tinkering around the edges, that he's making a basic change. It's important for us, and I don't mean to attack Mr. Biden, I have nothing against him beyond what he has always been, but this is silly. He's not doing anything comparable to what FDR did. And let's be clear, FDR did not change this basic society, which is why we are where we are, but he certainly made a bigger effort than anything being contemplated now. So let's be daring and face that. And I'll answer the question this way. FDR created the Social Security system. We never had that before in this country. You're 65 years of age or older, you get a check every month for the rest of your life. That's an extraordinary thing to do. To do that in the depths of a depression when the government has no money to do it is even more extraordinary. And it wasn't alone. He created the unemployment compensation system. That had never been done in American history before. You were unemployed, you're on your own. You're on your family, or you're on the soup line at the church. Then he passed the minimum wage, which we'd never had before either. And then he gave a government jobs program to millions of unemployed people. We'd never done that before either. These were structural changes. Even Republicans ever since were unable to mobilize to stop Social Security or to undo it, or unemployment compensation, or the minimum wage. Oh, they heard it, they restricted it, but they couldn't get rid of it. These were structural changes. Mr. Biden isn't proposing anything remotely like it. And let's remember, by the way, what Roosevelt did to pay for Social Security and unemployment compensation and to hire 15 million unemployed people. He taxed corporations and the rich. Let me just hammer that home again. He taxed corporations and the rich. The very thing Mr. Biden is not about to do. His proposal is to return the corporate income tax, which Trump dropped from 35% to 21%. He proposes to raise it to 28%. That's barely halfway back to what Mr. Trump cut. That's not a dramatic act. That's an act that's afraid to do anything. And that's what he proposes. He won't get that. He'll get less than that. I mean, that's extraordinary. He's not preparing to tax corporations and the rich anything like what Roosevelt did. These are pale, lame copies. And here's the irony of ironies. And I don't mean to scare you, but it should. Mr. Roosevelt, who created those structural changes and who paid for it by taxing corporations and the rich, a large part of it, was the most popular president in American history. He was reelected to the presidency 3 times. No other president had ever achieved that. That's right. The most popular politician in American history was the one who structurally transformed the economy for the benefit of the mass of people and paid for it by taxing corporations and the rich. Not only does Biden not dare to do it, but here's what should scare you. Because Biden is making no structural changes, and because we are an empire on the downswing, and because the condition, therefore, of the mass of people will continue to do what it has been doing in America for 40 years, namely decline, the failure of Mr. Biden to rise to the challenge is to prepare the route for the next Trump. The Republicans will campaign on the fact that for the mass of people, whatever Biden has done is too little and too late, and they will win on that basis, or at least they have a very good chance. But I don't mean to leave you with that. You're doing what you're doing at the Community Church of Boston is crucial to keep alive different ways of thinking, to dare to talk about what others are fearing to open up is crucial. I've been a university professor all my life. What you are doing is what is now in tune with the mass of the young people of America. They're the ones who have produced the Bernie Sanders movement more than anybody else. They're the ones who have voted into office socialists for the first time in 75 years in this country. They're the ones who are mobilizing left and right. And I mean left and right everywhere, not right-wing politically, where they are scarce. They're changing this country. They're the ones who haven't got the good jobs, who have no prospect of getting them, where the income won't be enough to cover their student loans, let alone. They're facing the reality that the American dream promised to them isn't available anymore. and that no one is going to help them get it unless they help themselves. You need to do what you are doing to get those ideas out there, because the ground is fertile. It needs your thinking, your daring, bringing speakers who are willing to say these things is an enormous contribution and will have lasting social effects.
Thanks. Dean, I wonder if I can break in.
Well,
This is Alan.
there's another question first. Alan, you're next, okay? And the
Yeah.
question is, what is the best source of existing worker co-ops? Which one can learn nuts and bolts from and possibly visit? That's from
I'm sorry,
Pat, who joined
I,
us
I,
before.
I did not hear you. I think you need your mic.
Oh, I'm sorry. Here we go. Is this better?
Yeah, much.
What is the best source of existing worker co-ops, which one can learn nuts and bolts from and possibly visit?
Okay, there are many, many examples. There are people around the world. It's important that you understand what I propose is not some utopian future that we can, cross our fingers that we'll maybe one day reach. It's already a reality. All around the world, people are opting out of the capitalist system with their feet. I'm going to give you a couple of examples to answer your question. The most famous example in the world, and one you can easily find out about, is called the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. Mondragon. Mondragon. Mondragon is a small city in the north of Spain. It is the world's largest and most successful worker co-op. It is in fact a corporation now. It is the 7th largest corporation in all of Spain. It is a family of about 200 individual worker co-ops. It started in 1956 when a Roman Catholic priest, Father Arizmendi by name, in that city made a famous speech to his parish. And it went like this: if we wait for somebody to come in here and hire us, we will all die of old age before it ever happens. The north of Spain was a very, very poor part of a poor country. And so Father Arizmendi proposed, let's not wait for some employer, some capitalist to come here. Let's be our own boss and start a worker co-op. So Father Arizmendi, with 6 other parishioners, started a co-op. Fast forward to the present. It has grown spectacularly. It now encompasses more than 100,000 workers in these 200 worker co-ops. In each co-op, which, by the way, there are manufacturing co-ops, service co-ops, rural and urban, industrial and agricultural, and so on. In these co-ops, the workers make all the decisions collectively, democratically. For example, they hire supervisors, and at the end of the year, they evaluate supervisors. If they don't like how the supervisors supervised, the supervisors are fired. Notice, the supervisors don't hire the workers. It's the other way around. There's a rule they've adopted. The highest paid worker cannot get more than 8 times what the lowest paid worker gets. In the United States, for a large corporation, the CEO gets roughly 300 times what an average worker gets. Therefore, they have eradicated inequality, or rather made it much, much narrower than anything that exists in the United States. It turns out that cooperatives can control and limit inequality in just the way we need in America, but don't have clue we ought to do it in a cooperative way. In California, around the Bay Area, there is a bakery and a cheese shop and a pizza joint. They're called the Arizmendi bakeries in honor of Father Arizmendi of Spain. They went from one such cafe, such bakery, to 5 of them now in the Bay Area. They've been there for 30 years. They love visitors. So does the Mondragon Corporation. There are co-ops all over the world. The economy in which the co-ops play the largest role is the province of Emilia-Romagna in Italy, where roughly 40% of all enterprises are worker co-ops, and they've been that way for decades. So they're all over the place. Here in the United States, we have something called the United States Federation of Worker Co-ops. They maintain an active website presence, internet presence. They will provide you with all of the information you want about starting one, financing one, running one, expanding one. All of that is, there are hundreds of worker co-ops in the United States, thousands and thousands around the world. Let me conclude with this. The Mondragon Corporation has a special program. If you ever visit the north of Spain, they will gladly give you tours of their worker co-ops, allow you to converse with co-op workers, find out why they love it. The Mondragon maintains its own university where they teach courses in how to start a co-op, how to run a co-op, how to finance a co-op. All of that technical nuts and bolts information is well known, organized into coursework, curricula, and all of the rest of it. And there are conferences all around the world, including the United States, where people moving in this direction help each other, talk to each other, provide each other with services. It's a remarkable movement. If you're interested, if what I've said today is of interest to you, we maintain a website also full of this kind of information. You can find it at very simply on the web, democracyatwork.info. Just go there. It's all available for free. Loads of ways to connect and link to other sources of information.
All right, I'm putting this all up on the chat. I believe that Alan from up in northern Maine wanted to join us. Hi, Alan.
Hi. Yes, I'm in Eastern Maine, actually. Richard, thank you so much for your talk. I've listened to you for some years on a radio station up here, WERU FM, in your Economic Literacy 101 program. And you just gave your website, but before you sign off, please, people can grab a pen or pencil and whatever, and don't be afraid to tell everyone how they can be in touch with all your work and so on. But anyway, I have a couple comments, a comment and a question, and I don't want to take away anything from your emphasis on collective workplaces and changes in that cooperation and things like that. But you had touched on the corporate taxes, corporate revenue to the federal government. And I mean, it's interesting that I know for the last, recently, it's in the 200 billions per year. And we talk about the tax rate frequently, but I think most Americans are just amazingly unaware how low the actual number of corporate revenue is. And it was, in the upper 200 billions, and now after Trump's tax cuts, I think it's in the lower 200 billions, which coincidentally is what Jeff Bezos' net worth is. So, who doesn't pay taxes, by the way, is my understanding. But the fact that this one man's wealth is like equal to or greater than what all U.S. corporations pay annually into the federal treasury is just mind-boggling. And so, in addition, we talk about some of the advantages in China. It's stereotypical advantages of lax environmental rules, like they have in Florida, and low-wage workers. Well, their tax policy is actually quite progressive, and I don't know what the exact numbers are, but it's my understanding that what the equivalent would be to our personal exemption is roughly double what it is in the United States, and their corporations pay a lot of taxes, and they pay more taxes than the people do. It's my understanding. I'm not sure if it's exactly accurate, but it's close. But I did want to ask a question about the massive deficits that are being expanded. And, you know, it strikes me that it's probably a form of servitude, sort of, to the population, and an addiction is sort of like, oh, we can't do anything, we can't make any changes because going forward we're going to have to be servicing this debt. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what your thoughts are on this expansion of national debt. And again, I don't want to take away anything from your emphasis on cooperation and our path forward. So thank you.
Thank you for your question. Let me do what you proposed at the beginning so I don't forget. I do a weekly radio and television program. It's called Economic Update. It's broadcast on about 100 radio stations across the United States, and it goes out via several networks to about 55 million American television sets every week for a half hour, where I do more or less what I'm doing with you now, although I often have guests of my own that I interview. You can find it either on radio, or if television, the Free Speech TV network carries it. Other networks, some other networks do. It's also posted on YouTube, so it's easily available to you. Just go to YouTube /economic update or YouTube /democracy at work. Those are the two phrases we basically use. And then you can engage this material. We have a very active Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram operation, many tweets that I do every day on all the things that are happening in an ongoing way. And again, you can find those at Democracy at Work or under my name, R.D. Wolff with 2 F's. And you're, of course, welcome to all of that. I would welcome your interest and your signing up for any of those things. Okay, let me go then to the big question at the end that you asked, the one about deficits. It's very important to understand the basic economics of deficits. When the government undertakes big spending, whether it's for a war, like in World War II, or whether it's for an urgent social program at home, such as combating COVID and or doing something about our aging infrastructure, there is immediately a question: how is the government going to pay for it under our existing system? There are really only 2 ways under our system. You could change it. There's a movement called modern monetary theory, which has another way, but I'm not going to deal with that now. The 2 traditional ways, which are still the 2 ways our government uses, are either by taxing to raise the money to pay for it that way, or by borrowing. Okay? You cannot raise these massive amounts of money by taxing the average taxpayer. And the only reason that's true is that the average taxpayer in this country is already tapped out, and they are politically unwilling and bitter about their being tapped out, about the taxes they pay, and they are unwilling to pay much more. But that's okay, because one of the reasons they're tapped out is because you have redistributed so much wealth over the last 40 years from the poor and the middle to those at the top. The inequality we have now is the product of that redistribution. So the government could go to corporations and the rich and tax them. Just to give you an example, after World War II, in the 50s and 60s, the top rate, income tax rate for the richest Americans was between 70 and 90%. The top rate now is 37%. It was dropped over the last 40 years for those at the top, not for the rest of us. So they have an enormous wealth, as we know. So the government could pay for the COVID program and the infrastructure easily by taxing the rich. And they wouldn't even have to go to the levels we once had to do so. But those people know that, and they have taken the steps necessary to buy the political system. There's no nice way of saying this. So it is not going to happen. So the politicians don't dare tax the rich who donate the money that makes those politicians have a career, who donate the money to keep those political parties from falling apart. So what then does the government do? And if you understand this, you will understand public finance all you need for the rest of your life. The politicians decide not to tax corporations and not to tax the rich. Okay, if you're going to spend a lot of money on COVID or on infrastructure, and you're not going to tax corporations and the rich, and you can't tax the mass of people, all that's left is for the government to borrow the money. And that, when it does that, it runs a deficit. That is, it's spending more than it takes in taxes, and it has to borrow the difference. But here comes the nugget for you to remember. Who does the government borrow from? Well, the answer is it can't borrow from the mass of people. They never lend to the government. They don't have enough money to do it. The only people domestically who can lend to the US government are corporations and the rich. And you know what they lend to the government? They lend the money that they didn't have to pay in taxes. That's the money they have available. They saved on taxes because the government didn't tax them. So in effect, a deficit means the government has chosen, the politicians have chosen not to tax corporations and the rich, but instead to borrow the money from them, which means they will have to pay them back 5, 10, 20 years from now, and they have to pay interest every year for that loan. The deficit finance in this country is the biggest single gift of the government to corporations and the rich. And you are absolutely right to be outraged at this behavior and to worry that you, me, our children will be having to pay all that back forever as it accumulates. And it is now accumulating at a much more rapid rate than ever before in peacetime, which is another sign of a declining empire.
Wow, that's phenomenal. We have time, I think, for one more question. If there's one more person, maybe Charlie, did I see your hand up just now? Charlie? Unmute. Charlie Welch.
Oh, Charlie.
There you go.
Hi. First, I'll open with I've made the suggestion early on in Trump's empire that Trump's regime that he was going to end or shorten the life of the empire by about 50 years. And I think I should have upped that as time grew on, but that's only a minor comment. That debt you were just talking about, I know China owns part of it, and I don't know what proportion is what. And the other question, you've alluded to the time, the productivity and the disparity in the productivity and where that money all went to the top. I imagine that's the same for Western Europe, maybe a little bit different, but do you have more detail on that?
Yes. The European, I'll go backwards. I'll start with the last thing you said and then go back to China. The Europeans have a much more powerful socialist tradition than the United States, at least over the last century. It is a remarkable difference. It is something that, again, you don't hear much about in the United States because it's an implied criticism. They raise more in taxes, they rely less on borrowing, and they do that because they're forced to. The power of labor unions, the power of socialist parties is much, much greater in Europe. I can see from some of your faces that maybe an example will help. I won't embarrass you by asking how many of you know the composition of the current government in the European country called Portugal. All right. In Portugal, the government is a coalition of 3 political parties. They won the election back in 2016, and they have continued to govern Portugal. There was a new election last year, and they were very successfully reelected. So here are the 3 parties that govern Portugal. Number 1, the Portuguese Socialist Party. Number 2, the Portuguese Communist Party. Number 3, the Portuguese Green Party. If you did not know that, it's because the American media do not tell you about this. There's nothing random about that. There's nothing accidental about that. I could give you many other examples. How many of you know that Angela Merkel's government in Germany was necessarily a coalition government? Her party, the Conservative Party, could not get a majority of the Germans to vote for them, and so they had a coalition with the German Socialist Party. That's what governed Germany, not Angela Merkel by herself. Okay? Emmanuel Macron is the current president in France. Now, he's horrible. I mean, he's awful. He's somewhere between Trump and Biden. That's how awful he is. But before he ran for president, he was a minister in the socialist government of François Hollande, the previous president of France. The power, the influence of socialism is just a different thing in Europe. Socialist parties, anti-capitalist parties, communist parties are powerful institutions in those societies, and have been, and that's why they have a very different way of dealing with all of this. Now let's deal with China. This is very important. China and the whole foreign situation. Yes, it is true that when the American government borrows money because it does not want to tax corporations and the rich, because the politicians have been put into office by corporations and the rich with the instruction, don't you dare tax us. Okay, so they must borrow. Most of what they borrow comes from American corporations and the rich, who lend to the government happily, because remember, from the point of view of the corporation and the rich, I'd much rather lend money to the government, it has to pay me back, than to have the government simply tax the money away from me. That's a no-brainer. Think about it. So of course, corporations and the rich understand they want those deficits as the preferred alternative to being taxed. Keep that in mind the next time you hear one of those corporate executives or rich people give you a 4th of July speech about how the government should stay within its limits and not overspend its budget. That is, to use the technical term, BS, and I'm being as polite as I can. But there is another lender to the United States government, and that is other countries who have a variety of interests in why they might lend to the United States government. One is to make the United States government think twice about attacking them because they owe these countries. You should be aware that the United States is the world's largest debtor country. That is, we owe more money to other countries than any other country on this planet. And you might find it amusing to know that the largest single lender to the United States for most of the last 25 years has been the People's Republic of China. Think about it. The world's richest capitalist country in hock up to its nose in debt, and the leading creditor is that Communist Party-run society in China. If you needed another sign of where the world is going, that's it. And if you weren't interested in avoiding all of these topics, you'd be talking about it. The Chinese own something in the neighborhood, nobody knows exactly, between $1 and $1.5 trillion worth of US government debt. And here's an interesting factoid for you to understand, and that you've also never read about in the paper. Since the Chinese government, run by the Chinese Communist Party, owns over $1 trillion of US debt, it means that every year the United States government has to collect from its people the taxes needed to pay interest on that debt to the Chinese Communist Party. If you assume a rough interest rate in the neighborhood of 4% on $1.5 trillion, right, then it means that $60 billion of the taxes you and I pay are collected by Washington and forwarded to China, I don't know, perhaps to build up their military. Why is that? Because the United States government, in its corruption, cannot or will not tax its own corporations and the rich, and instead borrows from the People's Republic of China, to whom it must then pay the interest imposed by not taxing corporations and the rich. And if you have never had this explained to you, then please understand what the educational system and the media in this society choose to explain or not explain, to cover or not cover, to shape and govern what you hear. That's part of what we have to change here in our country.
Richard, I wonder if I could just make a comment about debt in Asia. I think Japan has more debt than China now.
Recently, they've been one or
China,
two, and they wobble back and forth. That's correct. You're right.
I think in around 2015 or 16, China stopped taking on long-term bonds and just decided to go with like less than a year, 6 months or something bonds. When just a little aside here, that it's a dynamic situation. It's not, and probably will get more so. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, it's partly the Japanese made some decisions about lending. So did the Chinese. The Chinese are very worried that the United States, as it ratchets up its Cold War rhetoric against the Chinese, may be tempted to do something about not repaying the debt it has that the Chinese own. Would be an unbelievably short-sighted act, very close to a declaration of war, I mean military war. So it's not an immediate situation, but it's not a long-term tenable arrangement. You should be aware also, another statistic very rarely explained to the American people, that roughly 40%, the largest single chunk of stocks traded on the American Stock Exchange, the New York Stock Exchange, the NASDAQ, and so on. 40% of stocks in this country are owned by foreigners, and that includes the People's Republic of China. The ability of foreigners, if the United States frightens or threatens them, to disrupt the American economy is overwhelming. And the notion that we are not at risk in this world is an attempt by the people who run this system to avoid the growing awareness that I'm trying to correct about what it means when your economy is in decline.
Richard, thank you. Thank
You're
you.
very welcome, but Dean, I can't hear you, the mute.
Thank you very much.
All right, sir. I want to again, before I leave, I want to thank you all for the invitation. It really is an honor to address the community church. I remember going there, appreciating as a student some of the things that were done. But more than that, I appreciate that you are the institution you are and are committed to being that kind of voice in Boston. So it's been my pleasure, and thank you for the opportunity. Otherwise, everyone, goodbye, and please be safe.
Thanks so much. The honor and pleasure is ours, and we are doing our best to put a lot of those programs from the 70s and 80s digitally online. I want to tell everybody to spread the word that this presentation is wonderful, inspiring, moving, optimistic presentation is available on our own YouTube channel. And just tell folks that that's where you can go to see all of these Zoom programs that we've been doing for the last year and a half or so, for however long this pandemic has been going on. Thank you for all your questions, everybody. And finally, next Sunday, we have a wonderful program. It's 6 poets, 6 really distinguished poets. It's called A Murmuration of Poets. Amanda Shea, David Gillette, Martha Collins, Lloyd Schwartz, Fred Marchand, and Annie Gajika. Join us next Sunday. It's going to be a wonderful embarrassment of poetic wealth. Finally, a quick poem. You got to have hope. You got to have hope when every card seems lost. You got to have hope when you're double-crossed. You got to have hope when every flower is dead. You got to have hope even if it's just a thread. That's from Tom Pacheco. We want to wish you all a wonderful spring week, and we'll see you next Sunday. Meeting at the building is over. Thank you to Richard Wolff, to Dan Greenspan, and to Tim Ray. See you all, folks. Thank you, Jim Casteris, Kevin Devine, Homer, Faye, Jose Aleman, Barry Warner, Alvin Foster, Alan Clemens, and Lenny Shames. And of course, thanks again to Charlie Welch, our president and our technical director on these Zoom calls. Check out the Mondragon Cooperatives, Democracy at Work, which is Richard's online presence. And meeting at the building is over. Goodbye and do good work.